We are continuing in the book of Hebrews, and today is interesting. It's interesting. Maybe if you've been in the church a long time, certainly if you haven't, but even if you've been in the church a long time, I think if we actually sat back and listened to some of the things we talked about, we would. I think there's things we just kind of sang a lot. So this morning, this is going to be a bloody message, if you haven't figured that out. We've seen bloody songs, and yet, if you were like unchurched and came into the church, and just even if you just listen to the songs that we sang, what can wash away my sin? Nothing but the blood of Jesus. And then we sang, I think it was probably a good old Baptist hymn this morning, there is power in the blood. Well, what do you mean by power in the blood? I mean, what are these people? They're singing about power and blood. Maybe they had too much Halloween or something. I don't know. And so we I think just say through these things. And so even as I engage the text that we are working on this week, I found it interesting to even seek to explain, because it seems mysterious to us. I mean, how is there power in blood? And what does that all mean? It seems really kind of heady to me, and it is heady to me, and I'm supposed to be like like a pastor, and trying to how does that work? And we're going to come to a table that has wine that is blood, and bread that's body, and it's mysterious, and then I'm left with a passage to seek to try to share about it in a world, especially in the Western world, where everything tends to need to be concrete. We don't like the uncertainty. We don't like the mysterious. We like to know, and so the whole blood motif in Scripture, which is, by the way, there from the very beginning, is sometimes difficult to engage. So I'm going to read from Hebrews 9, 11 through 15, and hopefully that's what's up on the screen, because the cover slide is not necessary. Okay, so go ahead and put that up on the screen for me. All right. Every time I go somewhere, I did my uncle passed away in the last couple of weeks, and I did his funeral on the other side of the state. And every time I go someplace where there's not a screen in the back, it's like I'm lost. I need that screen in the back to do this. This is from Hebrews 9, 11 through 15. But when Christ came as high priest of the good things that are now already here. So if you've been here the few weeks prior, by the way, when you read through the book of Hebrews, it does seem to repeat itself, and it does. It's almost saying the same thing a whole different way to the people of God, because we just need the same thing said 100 different ways. And so here we still have language of high priest, which again is not language that would necessarily make any sense to us, but it's pulling from the Old Testament. Of the good things already here, he went through a greater and more perfect tabernacle that is not made with human hands. That is to say, is not part of this creation. He did not enter by means of the blood of goats and calves, but he entered the most holy place once for all by his own blood, thus obtaining eternal redemption. The blood of bulls and goats and ashes and heifers sprinkled on those who were ceremonially unclean to sanctify them or set them apart so that they were outwardly clean, how much more then will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciences from acts that lead to death, so that we may serve the living God. For this reason, Christ is the mediator of a new covenant, that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, now that he has died as a ransom to set them free from the sins committed under the first covenant. And that is really heady stuff. And so I'm going to try to take a step back and just talk through this passage. And so go back to the first slide of our scripture that we are doing today. Remember the book of Hebrews? is written to the people of God. It's written to the people of God who are living in very difficult and hard times. They are being persecuted for the name of Christ. They're struggling with Old Testament things, and Jesus has come, and there's people saying, well, Jesus didn't really cover all of that, and so the writer is telling them, and so they're going, they're leaving, in a sense, their first love. They're in danger of leaving Jesus and all the things that they've heard about him, because they're in this journey, and people are promising them other things in the journey. But we're all the same. The people of God have always been the same. So in this pilgrim's progress that we're on, it says Abraham in Hebrews was looking for a city whose builder and maker was God. We are, as it were, looking for our inheritance that we have been promised. And the book of Hebrews tells us that inheritance is a person, and his name is Jesus. And there are going to be things to distract us from the inheritance along the way. And so there's warnings, very big warning passages, but Hebrews is full of promises in the midst of that. And we've talked about some of those contrasts in prior weeks. And so it's written to the people of God who are struggling in their journey. They're not at rest. They're tired, they're exhausted. And they're tired and exhausted because they're trying everything but Jesus. And the writer of Hebrews is pushing them back, that Jesus he's better than angels, he's the better high priest, he's the better sacrifice, he's better. He's always better in Hebrews. Always more superior, always better than what is tiring them out and killing them, actually, leading them to death. That's the overview of the book of Hebrews. So to help us today, if we lived in the Old Testament times, and we had cars. They didn't have cars in the Old Testament, but say we did, because I think this will help us understand. And it is Sabbath day in the Old Testament, and we have our families, and we're getting ready to go to church, and we're loading the car up with our family, but every car that would go to church would need a trunk back in those days as they would go to church, because the family would have to ride in the car. But every Sunday when you would go to church, you would need a trunk full of animals to go with you. And the best ones. So you need a trunk full of animals. And you would not go to church unless your trunk was full. You wouldn't go to tabernacle, you wouldn't go to temple unless your trunk was full of animals. And it'd be a great teaching lesson, because little Isaiah is growing up, and he says, Mommy and Daddy, why are the bulls and goats in the back trunk? And what would Mommy and Daddy have to say? Because we're sinners. Right? In fact, you couldn't go to church, like I said last week. You couldn't mistake, if you came into the temple and didn't know what was going on, the temple was the place of the forgiveness of sins. And you didn't arrive without animals to help cover you. I think if we were in our world and our day, I think somehow we've created an idea about the Christian life that the people who actually go to church nowadays are the ones who would need to bring the least animals, right? No, that's the mentality. Who goes to church? Oh, I can't go to church. I'm not good enough. I have too many animals to bring to church. I can't go to church. The church is for the people who don't have any need to put the animals in the back of their car, because they are the good people. The whole economy from the Old Testament on is that when one comes to church or comes to worship, they come in need. Always. So when you come to the table here, the ones who come to the table are the ones who come in need. And mixed in all of this is blood. And I want to do my best to try to help us work through that, because in this passage, Jesus' blood is better than the blood of bulls and goats. And why is his blood better than the blood of bulls and goats? Why is his blood better than a trunk full of animals? And there's lots of reasons for that. One, because we don't need blood, a trunk full of animals anymore. And really briefly, I'm going to just touch. It says the place that he went to wasn't a place that was made with hands. It's not a physical place. It's not made with hands. In fact, it says it's not part of this creation. And Jesus' sacrifice, it was actually heaven itself. That's where the anchor is. You know, he's already passed through the heavens. He's already entered the most holy place. Jesus has done that. He's better because he's entered the holy place himself with his own blood. One of the things that's obvious about that is every year in the Old Testament, they had this thing called the Day of Atonement, where the priest would go in one year. We talked about that last year. He'd offer a sacrifice for his sins and also the sins of his people. And they would have to perpetually do this every year. Jesus' blood and sacrifice is better because it's once for all. It's once. We don't keep doing it. We don't keep re-sacrificing. We don't keep doing that. Jesus is better because through himself, through his person, he bypasses the temple. He bypasses the need for animals because he himself has become the sacrifice. So, it's better for those reasons, but it has power for at least two reasons that I'm going to bring out, and the one is this slide right here. He did not enter by means of bloods and goats and calves, but he entered the most holy place once and for all by his own blood, thus obtaining eternal redemption. There's something about Christ's blood that secures for us eternal, never-ending, never-failing redemption. It goes with the once for all. You know, every day you actually had to go. It's the other thing in the Old Testament, you not only had to go to a temple, the assumption was is you had something to be taken care of every day. Jesus' blood is eternal. It's once for all, and secures for you and I eternal redemption. There's a lot of power in that. And he's going to begin to explain, he doesn't keep. There's something very freeing about eternal redemption. If you lived in the Old Testament, your blood would need to be offered all the time. And in a way, you were only as good as the next day. You were only as good as the next day, so all of your energy was in making sure you had the best animal, making sure you showed up doing that. With Christ, because it is his blood, the blood of bulls and goats can't do it. He's actually secured redemption not by asking any more for the blood of bulls and goats, because it's his blood by which he secured his eternal redemption. But here's the other thing, and I think this is the place we tend to operate. It's by his own blood that he's secured our eternal, never-ending redemption. He doesn't ask for our blood. We have no blood in the game. We have no skin in the game. It's his blood. These are not my words. By his own blood, my redemption and your redemption is secured, period. Not by our blood, sweat, and tears do we secure eternal redemption. Not by our blood, sweat, and tears. I mean, here's the other thing. It's like it's His blood that secured eternal redemption, and it's our blood and sweat and tears that need to keep the eternal redemption. Well, if our blood and sweat and tears need to keep the eternal redemption, then His blood didn't buy eternal redemption. His blood didn't buy eternal redemption. If my blood, sweat, and tears secures that eternal redemption, then it's not eternal redemption at all. It's a one-time redemption, and hey, we'll see how it works out in the end. This becomes very important as we finish the next part of where the blood has power, because this truth that He has freed us unto eternal redemption also does something else, and you can go to the next slide. The blood of bulls and goats and ashes and heifers on those, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offer Himself unblemished to God, to do what? It cleanses our consciences. This blood, and by the way, these two things aren't separated. It's not like it secures eternal redemption, and then it also cleanses our conscience. Because the only way our consciences can be cleansed by this blood's power is if our eternal redemption is secure. If our eternal redemption is real. There are no cleansed consciences if our redemption is not eternal. So they're almost one and the same thing. So by His own blood, through the eternal Spirit by which He offered Himself, He cleanses our consciences. What does He mean by that? I would venture to say, I would say you're lying if you wouldn't be true about yourself. But everyone in this room is bothered by something in their conscience. Something they may have done in the past. Something you may have done this morning on the way to church. Something that you're contemplating or even think. I mean, your conscience can be seared and troubled by the very fact, not that you even did something, but that you actually thought something like, oh, I can't believe that, you know. I wish that guy got run over by a car, you know. I mean, our consciences are always troubled if we do in God's law. The purpose of God's law is to trouble our conscience, right? I mean, it tells us what God is like, but it's also written in our hearts. We know. Why did I think that thought? Why did I do that? So we have these troubled consciences, you know, and it doesn't matter how old you are or how young you are. Some of it goes on. You know, if you're young and someone caught you doing something and put it all over Snapchat and Instagram, and you're thinking, oh my word, how am I going to ever live that down? Can't take it back. My conscience is troubled. Maybe you've had some run-ins with the law, and right now I could Google you and a mugshot would appear on the internet, you know? It's always there. What do you do with troubled consciences? It just doesn't go away. There's something powerful about the blood with our troubled consciences. I'm going to go. You know, when I was in school, I think college, I had to take this literature class, and I hated literature class because we'd have to read these literature things, and then we would have to come back and write. If I'd have known then what I know now, I could write anything, and it would be good. I'd get an A on it. I don't know what that means. I mean, what do they mean? What does Shakespeare mean when he writes these things? But Shakespeare in his play Macbeth, there's a woman in there that works behind the scenes to get someone murdered. And there's this scene in Macbeth where her conscience is troubled. She's constantly rubbing her hands and rubbing her things, and all she can, she's rubbing and trying to clean, trying to wash her hands and over and over again she's saying, out, you damn spot, out, 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 out. I want to be cleansed. Like, I can't get free from this spot, this guilty stain. We all have those things. Just date for a while if you're not married. But you know what? I would venture to say, for those of us who are married, we have troubled consciences. We have things that we protect from our kids, from our spouses, things we would like to wash away. Adam and Eve had a troubled conscience in the garden. And what did they do? They went and hid. That's what we do, is we hide. And God meets them. And so the question is what do we do with our troubled consciences? What do we do with, another way of saying this, what do we do with our guilt? It says it cleanses our consciousness from acts that lead to death. In some translations that says, and these are hard words to understand, from dead works. Do you know how we try to remove our guilt? Well, religiously, and you don't have to be in the Roman Catholic tradition, but they have a word for it that even in the tradition I was raised, we did the same thing. We just didn't call it this word because it was too Roman Catholic. It's penance, right? I did this, so I need to do this. I messed up here, so I messed up my performance here, so that means I need to do this. I need to say so many prayers. I messed up yesterday, so this morning I need to have an extra long Bible time there. That's for the non-Roman Catholics, If I have a next Roman Catholic, then God will know that I'm serious, that I didn't. So we will try to assuage our guilt by performing something. It seems to be that was the problem here in the book of Hebrews. They were always trying to do something and perform something, and so we do it through penance. We pay for what we done. The other thing I do with my guilt when I start to feel guilty is I then tend to blame other people, right? It's not my fault. It's not my fault I did that. We can go all the way back. It's not my fault I did it. It's the woman you gave me. It's what Adam said, right? What was he doing? He had a troubled conscience. He had guilt. And he moved it. He blamed. Blaming is always a sign of a troubled conscience. It's not a sign of a free conscience. Even if you didn't do it, blaming someone else is still not a sign of a free conscience. So we pass it off. But in the garden, when Adam and Eve had a troubled conscience, God met them. And guess what happened? An animal was killed and blood was spilt. And God covered their guilt. He covered their troubled conscience. That's what he means here. A clear conscience means that we will not perform what are dead works. And these are works that are always they may be good. Most of the time in religious circles, they are good things. All of your busyness in the church could actually be dead work because it's just trying to make up for something. And you could even come because you did something in your past, and now you've come to know Christ, and you can't ever undo what you did in your past, but by golly, I'm going to come, and I'm going to do this in the church, and I'm just going to give myself away, and somehow in the balance of God, my good will outweigh what I did in the bad, and hopefully I can do more good than more bad I did in the prior part of my life. That's a trouble. Those are dead works. They're dead works because they're works that are for yourself. They're for your standing with God, and we get that here because instead of dead works being performed, it says that we not only won't do dead works, we actually now can serve God. We don't have to serve ourselves anymore because we're not guilty. There's power in the blood. And if we're not guilty, guess what that frees us to do? I don't have to blame. See, in blaming, I'm actually tearing you down to make me look better. We're free from that. You see, the blood applied to us by the Spirit will free us to serve. And you will say, well, what does that serving look like? Well, it looks like the fruits of the Spirit. It looks like we're free to love. We're free to have joy. We're free to have patience when someone's life isn't what you think it should be right now. We're free to have patience with those who disagree with us. Impatience destroys joy, and it destroys love. In Western culture, I think one of the most lacking, which then it's why we don't love, it's why we tear each other apart. Some of it's just because we're not very long-suffering and have no patience. And you know why? Because we're self-righteous and we're performing dead works. Dead works will always lead to impatience because you'll wonder why someone else isn't where you're at or someone isn't doing something the way you would do it. And if you're wondering why someone isn't doing something the way you would do it, it's a dead work, even if what you're doing is great. This blood does it, and it's the blood that has the power, which is why the Spirit points to Jesus, because it's in Jesus and his blood that joy comes from. It's where peace comes from. It's where long-suffering, it's where gentleness, kindness, and all of those things come, that we may serve the living God. You say, well, what does serving the living God look like? It looks like love. It looks like joy. It looks like peace, patience, kindness, gentleness. All of those things. What the blood does is it means freedom, and it means freedom for you and I. It means we're free. I grew up in a different kind of world than this, and so my kids interact in both worlds sometimes, and we were actually out of town, and I was with my son Reese, and we were with a family that we had grown up with, and Reese is finishing high school, and he's getting ready to go into college. And it was interesting or whatever, but it's like the adults in our lives, they just want to get the kids to the side. And so we were actually at a restaurant that had a buffet, and me and my friend, it was his parents, who was a friend I went to college with, we went to get our food at the buffet, but Reese, my son, had ordered something off the menu, so he didn't go, and neither did they. So we get back, and we're leaving the restaurant, and he says, Dad, when you guys left, to go get your food at the buffet, Mrs. So-and-so asked me what kind of spiritual grade I have. And he goes, and I thought for my son, one, I was warned by the fact that was a very foreign question to him. You're always taking your spiritual temperature. Listen, if we have troubled consciences, we will always be taking our spiritual temperature. And if we're really, really honest, our spiritual temperature isn't going to be very good. It frees you. And you know what happens when you're busy taking your own spiritual temperature? You're a narcissist thinking only about yourself, and you're incapable of loving your brother and sister in Christ because you're checking your temperature. And you know what happens when we check our own temperature? We get the thermometers out when we come to church and we start checking other people's temperature. The power of the blood is that we don't bring our thermometers to church because there is only one sacrifice, once for all, that has secured our eternal redemption. And what would happen if we had churches that never brought their spiritual thermometers? We would love each other. We would have patience with each other. We would be kind. We would be gentle. Sure, I'm sure we would talk to each other about serious things, struggles we have, sins that we're struggling with, sins that we would then point to the one who secured our eternal redemption to cover again by his blood, or be reminded that they were covered by his blood. It also frees us to not have to defend or blame. I know this is disconcerting. I know at times this may seem obnoxious, but I think the church should get more comfortable in living in this realm. The reality, if someone comes to me with a list of my sins, to have the freedom to say, that list that you just gave me, those sins don't belong to me anymore because I have been crucified with Christ and they are nailed to a cross and I bear them no more. So shut up. I know that makes us uncomfortable because we are to bear each other's burdens. We are in love, joy, peace, patience kind of ways to do it. But what I can say, and I said this a couple weeks ago, is those conversations will never appear as accusations, because when they appear as accusations, there is only one who is named accuser, and his name is Satan. That is his name. Our discussion with each other as we spur on one another to love and good deeds never comes an accusation. It frees you and I. When that list comes, hopefully we can understand it, when that list comes of accusations from the accuser whose name, or from Satan whose name means accuser, you know what Satan wants? He wants our blood. He wants our blood. Because guess what? We're probably guilty. Satan wants our blood. He wants his pound of flesh. And there's something about this blood that has power in it, that can say to the accuser, that list of sins are not mine, they're Christ. And the very Bible tells me that he was buried, and when he was buried, my sins went with him, and that when he rose again, they're no more. That's the blood. That's the power of the blood. And there is Jesus. It's interesting because in the book of Revelation chapter 12, it says Satan is the accuser, and the Satan is coming to accuse the men and women of God. And I think it's in verse 13 in Revelation 12, it says that the accuser will actually defeat it and triumph by his blood. Satan comes seeking yours and I's blood, and Christ gives us his. There's power. And in Revelation, the accuser himself will be vanquished by the blood. So this is no small thing we do here. It's a reminder of the evil one's accusations. You know where the accusations are true? We bring those sins to Jesus. If we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins. It's not that we don't have sins. If we say we have no sin, we're a liar, and the truth is not in us. The last illustration, which is biblical, that I want to use, speaks to the power of this blood. If we opened up the Bible to the very beginning of the Bible, there is a story right after Adam and Eve have sinned and been thrown out from the garden. Sin immediately comes into the world, and they have two sons, and they're Cain and Abel. I won't go into the totality of all of that, but Abel trusted in what God had promised and brought what God had asked to bring for sacrifice. Cain got mad, and he killed Abel. And growing up, I never really realized this because I don't know what we were too busy trying to accomplish or prove or whatever. But God actually comes to Cain and asks Cain. Now, there aren't very many people on the earth at this time, so God knows what happened. But he asked Cain, "Where's your brother Abel?" And Cain says those famous words, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Yes, you are, Cain, but that's another story for another time. He says, "I don't know, am I my brother's keeper?" Then God says to Cain, "Abel's blood is crying out to me." I know. Your brother's blood's crying out to me. You know, and I was raised in a tradition where, if you actually read the story, this isn't true. What Abel's blood crying out meant that God had come looking, or Abel's blood was crying for revenge. Abel's blood was crying for justice. We know that not to be the case, one, because of what happened, and two, because of an account in Hebrews, which I'm going to close with here. But when God comes to Cain and he says, "Abel's blood is crying out to me," Abel was one who knew the love and mercy of God. What you actually have in the book of Genesis is he's saying that Abel's blood is crying for mercy for you, Cain. It's crying for mercy. And what did God give to Cain? Mercy. He gave him mercy. Cain knew the consequences. Cain knew the reality. And there is Abel's blood, one who knew the Father, one who knew who God was, crying for mercy for his brother. And then we get to Hebrews 12, and it actually mentions that incident and says there is a blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. There's the word better again. Jesus' blood is better than Abel's blood. Because we too have murdered God. We too have murdered God. And this blood that has so much power is crying out for mercy for me and for you and for all who would come. Jesus' blood, like Abel's blood, is crying out for mercy. But it is a better word because God gave through Abel's blood crying out mercy. God gives us, yes, mercy through Jesus Christ, but what makes Christ's blood more powerful and better? It speaks a better word because with this blood not only comes mercy for our sin, we get his righteousness too. We're not just pardoned. We're not just shown mercy. We, by his blood, are made righteous with God. How much more then will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our conscience from acts that lead to death? Is that my phone going off? It could be back there. This table, this blood has power, and it speaks a better word than the blood of Abel, because it only speaks mercy to you and I. it speaks that we are righteous. That's how it secures eternal redemption. In the Old Testament, you just had to come for mercy and mercy and mercy and mercy each time. In Jesus, we get mercy, but forever we are made right. Forever we have eternal redemption. There's power in the blood. There's power in the blood. Sinners plunged beneath this blood lose all their guilty stains. All their guilty stains. It's a bloody message. Want to talk about it? My friend actually was a worship director in a larger church in Orlando. Senior pastor came to him. I just quoted a song, "There's a Fountain Filled with Blood." Said, "We won't ever sing that song again in our church." This is a PCA, our denomination. Because people don't understand the blood stuff. There's no hope without it. None. And the book of Hebrews is a bloody book. But it is a blood that's better than the blood of bulls and goats. As we come to this table, and those who are helping serve come, we will be reminded of that again. He is the eternal high priest. He's the high priest that comes and then offers his body and blood and tells us to partake of this until the Lord returns again. This table is for those who are desperate for Jesus, for those who know they need the power of the blood. This table is offered by Jesus himself. He is our great and eternal high priest. Remember last week there was a guy in the Old Testament named Melchizedek who kind of came and went. We don't know a lot about him. We know he was superior than Abraham because Abraham had to give to him. He was the one who blessed Abraham. Do you know in the Old Testament, Melchizedek actually gave Abraham a meal, and I know. You guys think I'm probably crazy half the time, but I don't think anything's a mistake. Do you know what Melchizedek fed Abraham? Bread and wine. That's what the high priest is always offering. I don't think that's a mistake. Christ comes and offers his body and his blood. The disciples were confused that night. They were confused for a lot of reasons, but one was surrounding even these words of institution. Because Jesus would say, "Take, eat, this is my body, and drink, this is my blood." Well, if you were a good Old Testament person and knew your Old Testament really well, and you had been versed in the Old Testament and read the book of Leviticus, you would know one thing that you were never ever to do was to drink blood. And Leviticus tells us why you were never to drink blood. In the book of Leviticus, it says, "You don't drink blood because the life is in the blood." Jesus appears on the scene and says, "Here's some blood. Drink it because it's true. The life is in the blood. And it's my life for your life. It's my body for your broken body." It is the good news.